All right, well, good morning. Sorry I didn't get this posted yesterday, but today we're going to look at the second half of our topic for this week, which is Christian societies in Europe. And so we're going to look at what's called the Middle Ages in Western Europe. So, a brief overview. So, this time period is 500 to 1500 Common Era. This is referred to as the Middle Ages or the medieval period. So, why middle? It's basically the time period that's sandwiched between the fall of Rome and the beginning of the Renaissance. The duration is, as I said, the fall of Western Rome around the 5th century, and it's going to be during this time that Europeans are going to develop a feudalistic system for political structure, and then the Catholic Church will be definitely very powerful and rise in prominence. There's usually two phases, the early Middle Ages and the high Middle Ages. And in fact, our textbook, which, as you know, I don't rely on too much, they divide these two into two different chapters, 16 and 19. So the early Middle Ages is seen as the period of decline in Western Europe. Some historians used to call it backwardness, and this is when Western Europe is seen as being very vulnerable to attacks from immigration and barbarians, Vikings, and then you have the High Middle Ages is where the turning point when Europe starts to slowly emerge out of that decline, and you see an increase in trade, intellectual activity, the Gothic era, Gothic architecture, and that's basically the High Middle Ages is what leads into the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is technically our next time period, so that's that turning point with our European history. This is a time where we have extremely devout Christians with strong participation, and there is going to be a fervor to spread religious beliefs by missionaries. So that's one of our key concepts, looking at the spread of Christianity during this time. We will see a change in the relationship between the West and other regions during this time. Europe was originally at the mercy, so we're talking about the early Middle Ages, was originally at the mercy of invasions such as Vikings and barbarians. These frequent invasions are going to prolong or elongate or delay development in the West. So that means this time period of weakness is going to last for quite a while, because it's very difficult to develop stable governments while you're under constant attack. However, we will see increasing participation in trade with Asia and Africa. So, Western Europeans will have contact with the Byzantines and Arab Muslim merchants. There will also be contact through the Crusades. And the Crusades is going to teach Western scholars advances in math, science, and philosophy. So a lot of the Greek learning from the Hellenistic era that the Byzantines and both Arab Muslims preserved, Western Europeans will basically come into contact with that knowledge once again after losing it from the fall of Rome. And that's why you may have heard of the phrase the Dark Ages, and we don't refer to it as the Dark Ages anymore. Historians have uncovered a lot more information since that term became commonplace. But the early Middle Ages, that first phase of decline, is sometimes what's referred to as the Dark Ages, because it is seen as this time period of, loss of, knowledge and rationality. Western Europe is going to be very nervous about Islam, and they're going to see it as a false religion and a threat to Christians in the Holy Land. Yet they will actively copy some elements of Islam, such as law codes, science, and art. Spain is going to, sorry if you heard that buzzer, that was my dryer going off. Spain is unlike most of Western Europe at this time. So, we consider Spain part of Western Europe, but they're going to develop quite differently, because as you know from a couple weeks ago, Spain during this time is actually under Muslim rule with the Cordoba Caliphate. So the early Middle Ages. So essentially Western Europe consisted of Germanic tribes that had invaded the Roman Empire and settled throughout various parts of Europe. Most inhabitants of these kingdoms were pastoral nomads and subsistence farmers. So when you are a subsistence farmer, kind of think small scale, you're essentially farming to feed yourself and your family, so there's not like a huge surplus to maintain a large empire. Political leaders were tribal chieftains. Very few people could read or write, so again, that stereotype of the Dark Ages. During the early Middle Ages, very little long-distance trade, and settlements were mostly villages and towns. So the economic system that's going to develop in Western Europe during this time is known as manorialism. So keep in mind, sometimes people interchange the manors with feudalism, and they're not interchangeable terms. So manorialism is very specific as a economic system. They did coexist together, but feudalism is a political system, manorialism is an economic system. So I just want to make that distinction for you guys. So it's an economic system in which peasants, also known as serfs, were tied to the land to supply labor to their lords on estates. And it's that land, the estate, that's known as a manor. It actually originated in Rome, so this is a cultural trait or continuity from the Roman Empire that continued to develop in Western Europe. And so why would serfs devote their labor to the lords? Well, it was a reciprocal relationship, which means both ends benefited from that relationship. Serfs were obligated to give their lord a portion of their produce in exchange for grazing animals on his land. So serfs were not wealthy enough to own land, but the lords provided them land to use for grazing. So the exchange is will then the serfs grow enough food to feed their lords. The produce is used to sustain all who live on the manor. Serfs are not the same as slaves, and lords protected serfs and provided everyday needs. What are lords protecting serfs from? All those invasions, whether it be the Vikings or other barbaric groups. So that was the reciprocation that occurred in the manorialism system. Levels of production are very low, so this is not like mass production like the Chinese producing silk. So levels of production are low, technology was very limited, and this will lead to land ownership being the primary means of attaining wealth and power. So I talked about that, I believe last week, where one of the continuities in period 3 is that it's still all about land ownership and attaining wealth and power. This is a very local level community system, no involvement in the military because of localized nature. Manors helped to create a system of local politics with regional aristocrats. So again, this is why in Europe you never really see a massive widespread empire like we've seen in some other regions. So even politics become very regionalized or fragmented. Most common form of political organization until the Vikings invasions of the 9th century. Weaknesses, isolation. So again, you don't have strength of numbers due to poor communication networks, political instability. There's often warfare and raids, and you had no centralized government in Western Europe at this time. So what I'm going to ask, as you can see right here, is get out a sheet of paper, because in a moment you're going to see a sketch of a manor, and I would like for you guys to draw a sketch of it yourself. So you're going to have to pause the video. Don't worry about your artistic skills, just kind of get down the basics. But essentially, that is what a manor looks like. And so you can see here, you have a church on the lord's estate, the manor house, usually surrounded by woodlands because the forest would have been cleared for food production. You've got fields, grazing animals. You've got what you need, your blacksmiths. You have housing for the serfs. You have more field for planting, village. But essentially, this whole manor is ruled or owned by one lord, and then all these people contribute together in that system. So feudalism, so to kind of get into the other component that occurred at the same time. Feudalism is a very complex system of political and military loyalties that link lords together, because sometimes you would have a major threat, so lords would have to collaborate with one another and join their forces to fight off a common threat. So lords owned most land and large estates, and they would usually unified under a king. However, this is a very unstable system because that meant kings always had to rely on the loyalty of their lords for military endeavors, because kings themselves didn't have large armies. This isn't like a modern nation with a large standing army. So if a king had to go fight to protect his territory, he had to ask the lords to be willing to go fight for him. I don't know what TV you guys watch, but I did binge watch the first 4 seasons last year of Vikings. It's a show on, I don't remember if it's the History Channel or AMC, but I watched it through Amazon Prime. But long story short, that first season does a great job, if you can even watch a few episodes, of really painting that picture of the king-lord relationship. There's a good scene in that where the king in one of the kings in England, because England wasn't even England at this time, it was still small kingdoms, but he has to call upon his lords to try to fight or resist the Viking raids. And they had this huge debate because then the lords are concerned, well, if I make my people fight, how are we gonna get a benefit from this? And so kings at this time in the early Middle Ages were definitely not as powerful as they'll become later on. Nobles and landlords offered privileges to vassals in exchange for military service in the lord's army. So vassals owed rulers military service through knights, goods, payments, councils, would sometimes receive land in exchange. And so you're seeing a moment, a slide. This is basically the social hierarchy of feudalism. Peasants exchanged their labor for the security provided by lords. Feudalism essentially utilized the manor system. Everyone had their place in the hierarchy, and it contributed to the ultimate concern, which was security. So early Western Europe, that was their main concern: security from barbaric invasions or Viking raids, outside threats. So feudalism and manorialism actually worked together to coexist. So manorialism was the economic component, feudalism was the political and military component. So why feudalism? Once again, it all comes down to invasions. Invasions were initially the Goths from the east, so the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths of the late Roman Empire. These people will settle through manors, feudalism, and this will eventually evolve into the kingdoms of Western Europe that you're probably more familiar with, such as the beginnings of France and then England. So Western Europe will never be a massive empire like we've seen in China or in times in India, or even like the Abbasid dynasty, caliphate throughout the Islam, Dar al-Islam. So Western Europe will eventually, yes, political stability will occur, and this will evolve into kingdoms, but you're going to have a bunch of fragmented kingdoms in Western Europe. The Vikings invade in the 9th century. Western Europeans will turn to feudalism for greater protection, but manorialism is not abandoned as an economic system within small communities. So what you have here is kind of cartoonish, but you can see the social hierarchy with king at the top. And he was appointed to control the people. You have lords. They were appointed for protection and to handle territory. Knights, their position was to appointed to protect both the lord and the king. And then you have serfs. They were appointed to work the land. So one of our themes this year is social stratification, and that is the social stratification of Western Europe at this time. And here's just another more detailed social pyramid. You can always pause it and take a closer look at that. So the benefits of feudalism: it provides greater protection against raids. It is going to lead to political stability, and then eventually kings will start to tax their people, and then they'll be able to build their own standing army. And over time, that's going to create a huge shift in European society, because that means kings are no longer going to need to rely on their lords to ask for military service. But the bigger issue here is that through this feudalism system, and as lords become more connected under a single king, manors are no longer be as isolated as they were before. So that's kind of where they start to create their protection in numbers. So you have early kingdoms. Here's a couple of maps. Again, you can pause it, look closer at that. So the result of feudalism: growth of strong feudal monarchy in Europe is going to evolve over many centuries. The manors will eventually be absorbed into larger kingdoms. Manors become economically self-sufficient and engaged in barter. So one of the things, it comes up in the key concepts is what kind of economic systems existed. And in early feudalism, you mostly relied on barter, so direct exchange of goods. I'm going to exchange my sheep for your cow. So that's barter. So it's not as, so their economic system is not as sophisticated, because what we're going to see in a couple of weeks, like China is already starting to print paper money. In Dar al-Islam, they already have banking systems, and the word sakk, S-A-K-K, leads to the modern word for check, so like writing a money check. So definitely not, their economy is still much more simplified than other regions during this time period. The result: regional monarchies with strong aristocracies. So yes, you have a monarch, you have a king, but they are going to have to rely still quite a bit on the loyalty of their lords. And so this is what I was referring to earlier. This is actually a map of England, but England was not all unified, during this time period. So you have the Kingdom of Northumbria, the Kingdom of Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Sussex, Kent, Wessex, Wales. In fact, when I was making my reference to the show Vikings, I believe it was the king of Northumbria who was, calling upon his lords to resist Viking raids. So the results of feudalism, eventually kings are going to grow in power and want to conquer territories and control more territory. And what's interesting, William the Conqueror, he was the Duke of Normandy. So in fact, he was from northern France, and he will sail across the English Channel and invade and conquer the kingdoms of England. And the Duke of Normandy was actually, William the Conqueror is actually a descendant of Vikings that had invaded the French territories and eventually settled there. So he is credited with introducing feudal monarchy to England following his invasion in 1066. He's going to declare that vassals must swear allegiance to him. So this is where we start to see this shift happening in kings trying to create more centralized authority over their territories. And so now, the vassals, because remember, vassals were under lords, and before vassals had their allegiance to lords, but now he's requiring vassals and all peoples to declare allegiance to him and not the lords. So we are going to see through the medieval Europe where there starts to be this transition where kings try to solidify the power away from the lords into their own hands. So again, they're paying allegiance to kings and not the vassals. So this is what's known as centralization or consolidation of power. So that's, when I talked to you yesterday about, or on Thursday, about, essay writing and narrowing your Sprite G topics for essays, that's a way of narrowing. Instead of saying political, you would say consolidation of power. So, pause the video and I would take a moment to do those review questions. So the Vikings, so they are of Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish descent. So if you look at the map here, you've got, let me look a little closer at it here. Oh, there we go. So basically this region through here. And it was actually a lot of fun. I got to go to Iceland last year, and a lot of Viking history there. So the raids lasted from the 8th to 11th centuries, and so it's really the Vikings that are kind of create centralization of power in Western Europe, because as those Mainers start to collaborate, and leads to feudalistic kingdoms to protect themselves against Viking raids. Why were the Vikings so scary? Well, they were a pretty brutal people. They were polytheistic, or pagan is the word often used. But they built these really efficient long ships, and so you kind of have the picture here. And they were very narrow, but they were kind of like really just massive canoes. But they were good because they can travel by ocean and rivers. And Europe has lots of rivers. So if you look here, you see all those little blue lines. So Vikings could raid very easily sailing down the rivers with these long ships. They're very lightweight, stable, easy to handle in rough water. I mean, it's actually pretty amazing if you look here that they were able to travel from here to, all these different territories. They even eventually make contact in North America on these long ships. Around the 10th century, the raids begin to cease because essentially they start to settle down. And so it's basically that 3 centuries there that this occurred. They begin to convert to Christianity, and they become settled peoples in Europe. They continue to explore the northern Atlantic. They do settle in Iceland and Greenland. North America, they visit but don't settle and leave. So Europeans that settle in North America is going to be down the road with the British Puritans and so forth. So now looking at, as I mentioned, Western Europe is very tribal and fragmented, and so you had the Franks, the Carolingians, and Charlemagne. And this was going to be the closest Europe ever came to really being an empire. And so you could kind of see it right here, but it was very short-lived. Near at Spain there, that was the Cordoba Caliphate, and this is the British Isles, and this is where all the Vikings were coming from Scandinavia. But the Franks essentially were a tribe that settled in what is present-day France. And so you can see the association there where France got its name from. And they're going to briefly unite all of Western Europe under one king, King Clovis. And he converted to Christianity in the 5th century. So again, there's that theme of conversion of religion for political stability. In 732, Charles Martel, a Frankish ruler, is going to defeat Muslims in the Battle of Tours. So it's going to be the Franks that are credited with, preventing any more Muslim invasions into Western Europe. So that's kind of where you have that dividing line there. So they halt Muslim advances in Western Europe, more to do with Arab exhaustion than actually Carolinian strength. During this time, the Arab dynasties were pretty active in conquering, and it was just starting to wear them down. From 800 to 888, Frankish Carolinian dynasty was the ruling family of the Franks, is going to grow in power. So the Carolinians, that's the family of these Frankish peoples that are going to rise to power. Like I said, origins of modern France and Germany. And they take control from the descendants of Clovis. And it's going to be Charlemagne that's going to really get the credit of ever being the closest thing ever to a emperor of Europe. Alright, so the Carolingian family and Charlemagne will conquer most of mainland Europe. Charlemagne ruled from 800 to 814. The unification under Charlemagne was driven by need for protection against the waves of attacks and raids from the Vikings. And, the Catholic Church was still very well rooted in Rome. And this is where the Catholic Church is going to start to create a precedent for their not just religious but political authority throughout Western Europe. The Pope is going to coronate Charlemagne as the first Holy Roman Emperor. I understand the Holy Roman Empire is never actually an empire, and we'll discuss that. But by the Pope crowning Charlemagne and ordaining him through God to be a leader, the Pope basically set a precedent in Western European politics that in order to be king, you must be approved by the Pope. So in the Byzantine Empire, we'll compare and contrast right now. In the Byzantine Empire, they had Caesaropapism. So basically, Justinian, for example, was the emperor and the head of the church. Western Europe, the Pope and the kings are two separate individuals, obviously. However, a king must have papal approval. So that's going to be a little difference of the relationship between politics and religion in Western Europe. So the Pope's coronation of Charlemagne as the first Holy Roman Emperor sets a precedent that the Church approval is necessary to legitimize or validate or justify Western political power. And so this is going to start to lead to an increase in the authority of the Catholic Church in Western European politics. And Charlemagne will set up an administrative system, and he will divide the empire into counties. So we've seen this style of government quite a bit in our larger territories. So Charlemagne continued, eyes and ears, Missi Dominici. So he is going to create a spy system. We've seen that as well. The Persians did that. And so basically government agents that were to report back to the king to ensure the loyalty of all of his advisors. By 843, the Treaty of Verdun, the empire is going to fragment into 3 different kingdoms after his death. And so, like I said, the closest Western Europe ever came to an empire was just really under his rule, and it was not, long lasting. And the empire is going to fall apart because of less talented heirs. Under Charlemagne and beyond his lifetime, feudalism is going to develop into a system based on the loyalty of the elites, lords, vassals, and overlords. So looking at the rise of the Catholic Church in Western Europe. So the RCC, or the Roman Catholic Church, after the split between West and East, the bishops of Rome eventually come to be called popes. In the 300s and 400s, Catholic missionaries began converting Germanic and Celtic peoples of Western Europe. They built monasteries. So this is part of the key concepts as well. How did Christianity spread? So monasteries is where devout men and women gave up their possessions and devote their lives to the church. So the vocab word for that is asceticism as well, Ascetism. I think I spelled that wrong. I don't know. We'll have to look it up. But asceticism. And so that's going to play an important role in providing stability. It's going to be, this is where you're going to have a maintenance of literature and libraries. They're going to copy books. And so this is also part of the reason why historians have gotten away from using the phrase Dark Ages for this time period. While many people did not read, it's not like there's a complete loss of intellect and knowledge. It was just being preserved by few in number. It's going to be, in the Benedictine rule is going to be established in these monasteries, and basically this is the Catholic rule system that is that that monks and nuns are supposed to follow, and it was a pretty, regimented schedule of rituals of prayer, labor, and simple eating. Rulers such as the Frankish king Clovis will convert to Christianity as a means to unify his subjects, and in the Catholic Church will spread throughout Europe primarily for that reason. Canon law will be established by the Catholic Church. These are the moral boundaries set that were imposed on feudal leaders. And so, again, this is where the Catholic Church is going to start to assert its authority, and it also inhibited the development of political authority. How so? The power of the church to conduct excommunication. So this is the power of the Pope to separate people from the church. So if a king did not follow papal authority, the threat was that they'd be excommunicated. And when you have a populace that believes that excommunication would prevent you from going to heaven afterwards, that was a pretty strong threat. So that was the punishment for not obeying papal authority. Or interdict, denying religious rights to all people within a ruler's realm. So that's especially before death, having those rights read to you as part of their religious beliefs. And so basically the church said they were going to deny the spirituality component if their authority wasn't followed. So the Holy Roman Empire. This is what's going to emerge from one kingdom, from the kingdom of the Treaty of Verdun. And the position falls into disuse after Charlemagne's kingdom collapses. So the brief potential of there actually being a Holy Roman Empire is under Charlemagne, but it fell apart. But the name remains. It's going to be revived in 962 under Otto I, and he'll be crowned Holy Roman Emperor. And the reason why it's not an empire in the way that we've traditionally looked at empires is because it was actually a very loose confederation of German princes who named one emperor of their own. So it began with Otto I, who was crowned by the Pope. And it implied power rested with the Pope. However, loose confederation is key here. Princes often challenged the authority. They often disregarded the authority of the Holy Roman Emperor because they had their own localized ambitions. And so it's by no means a traditional empire as we've seen before. However, it merged classical and Christian claims and proclaimed itself a Christian continuation of ancient Rome. So just like the Byzantines were trying to continue the glory of Rome, that was kind of the idea of the Holy Roman Empire as well. It does provide for a period of time a small amount of stability, but power of the emperor was limited because he was a subsidiary to the Pope. So eventually that's going to lead to conflict between political and religious leaders. Not an actual empire, princes kings often clashed with the Pope in Rome. Most of Germany was still run by feudal lords, and most of Italy and city-states was also ruled by, whether it be wealthy merchant families or local leadership. So essentially the HRE over time is just really difficult to enforce. So it's more of a concept than an actual tangible empire. It dissolved in 1806 during the Napoleonic Wars, so we'll see that later on after the French Revolution. French philosopher Voltaire is famous for saying it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. And there you have the territory that was considered the Holy Roman Empire. And then this is just to show you at this point now, because we've talked about quite a bit in the last just 2 weeks in our post-classical period. So earlier, this week we talked about Kiev Rus. This is the Holy Roman Empire, the Franks. You had some Christian territories, Muslim Spain, England, Swedes, Norwegians, the Danes. Those were our Vikings. You can see, the Google slide thing always pops up. But this green territory, Muslim Caliphate, and then the Byzantine Empire, and then you have smaller Eastern. Croatia there is Eastern European, but then you have the smaller states in the Italian peninsula. So now we're going to see this transition out of our early Middle Ages to High Middle Ages. And this is, what people used to refer to emerging from the Dark Ages as signs of recovery began to emerge. So what is the shift? We start to see increased urbanization. This means the development of cities and towns. So not just having serfs plowing the lands and producing food for their lords. So that also means we're going to see a decline in manors. So towns grew, small cities start to emerge. So basically Western Europe is going to start to become much more cosmopolitan, like the Byzantines, China, parts of India, the major cities in the Muslim caliphates and so forth. You start to see an increase in social mobility. So that means that feudalistic, manorial social hierarchies could start to become a bit more flexible. Social classes become more complex because you're going to start to have traders and merchants that are going to acquire wealth. Increased trade with Asia, the Byzantines, Muslims. So they are going to have contact with increased contact with those peoples. Trade will lead to the emergence of a middle class, merchants. So it's also increased economic activity, and then they evolve out of the traditional barter system of exchanging goods. So they're now going to have banking and money. You're going to see the development of universities. You're going to see a decline in feudal political structures, especially when kings start to tax and start to build their own armies, so they no longer need to rely on lords and vassals. And you're going to start to see the strengthening of nation states, and this is going to eventually lead to the modern word nation and how we view countries today. And new warfare technology will emerge out of this. So how did kings start to limit feudal government? So by the 1400s, monarchies grew in power. They were able to raise armies through taxes, thus less reliance on lords, and began to centralize authority. Sorry for the typo there. So that's key to understand. When we look at the key concepts and look at, okay, how did governments solidify power? How are governments different in this time period than the last time period? You know, these are the things that we're looking at. Hence, the growth of feudal monarchies is going to cut into aristocratic lords' power. So over time, the lords are going to lose power because kings are able to tax directly and build their own armies. There will be attempts to limit the monarchical power or monarchy. So one of the things, the central question that starts to emerge in Western Europe at this time is, where does ultimate authority actually rest? Is it monarchs, aristocrats, or the church? And those three will clash. 1215, so looking at some of those clashes, the Magna Carta is one of the key documents of world history. Comes up in U.S. history as well because it later inspires our founding fathers. But in 1215, the Magna Carta is when the English King John had to recognize the supremacy of written law. This means King John was not able to completely claim divine authority from God. He had to recognize written law by men in Parliament. So this is a huge shift in the relationship and social hierarchy, where Parliament, the British Parliament, basically established with the king, or sending the message to the king, you are limited in what you're allowed to do, and there are laws that limit you. And so this also opened the door that it wasn't just kings that decided taxes in England. This is an English document, but Parliament had a very vocal voice in that as well, and that's going to eventually lead to a tradition of representative government here in the United States. So it granted basic rights to noblemen. So keep in mind, this is like aristocrats battling for authority with the king. If you are a serf, a lowly peasant, or even a merchant, you are definitely not sharing any authority here. But this will be considered the first step in Western Europe towards limiting government, meaning that a ruler cannot just strictly claim divine right from a higher god, being deity, but it came from written law. And then 1265, about 50 years later, the first English Parliament actually forms. You have the House of Lords, nobles, church, House of Commons were elected representatives. And again, this is another check on royal authority. And, compared to other parts of Western Europe, England is much more, progressive in this viewpoint, in that you had first noblemen checking the power of the king, and now you have an established parliament checking the power of the king. And for that reason, England is going to be one of the first countries to have representative government. Now, there will be an English Civil War. Things aren't always completely harmonious, but England is going to stabilize politically a lot earlier than some of our other Western European countries, and that's going to down the road enable England to surpass other territories in economic development. They're going to be the first country to experience the Industrial Revolution, and that's all tied together because when you have political stability, your economy can grow and prosper. And there's just an old picture of the Magna Carta. So, limiting feudal governments. So, from the 11th to the 12th century, most of Europe was divided in what's known as three estates. So, kind of think of that as three main social classes. So, you had the church, nobles, and commoners. Legal rights were based according to your state. So if you were a poor commoner, you had the least amount of legal rights. Despite all this, monarchs continued to increase in power. You will see the Hundred Years' War between France versus England over territories of the English king that he controlled in France. Large conflicts like the Hundred Years' War led to early ideas of nationalism, and that's the key thing to keep in mind. We're not going to really get into the details of the war itself, but what it did is it sparked a passion in people to identify as French or to identify as English, and that's going to eventually lead to this modern idea of how we identify today through nationalism. Because kings are the leaders that embody a country's principles. Hence, a new conflict will emerge heading into the modern era. Old governing rulers of feudalism and new claims of nation states. So feudalism is going to essentially start to crumble. And I would pause there for your quick review questions, or maybe take a break and then come back to this. So now the Crusades, and I had you guys read on this on Newsella, but these were the holy wars to reclaim holy lands, most notably Jerusalem from Muslim rule. It was actually prompted by requests from the Byzantine emperor, who needed assistance in resisting Turkish incursions into his territory or invasions. So he called, upon Pope Urban II. So it's interesting, with the big schism, the Great Schism between the Eastern Orthodoxy Church and the Catholic Western Church. But here the Byzantines were essentially asking for help, and Pope Urban II will call upon Western Europeans through religious convictions to try to end Muslim control of the Holy Lands. And initially successful, but ultimately they'll end with defeat, meaning Christian societies will never reclaim control of those territories. There were 4 crusades in whole. In the end, Christians did not reclaim Jerusalem. They'll pass through the Byzantine Empire through the Crusades and through the fighting, though, and all the architectural achievements will be noted, and so Western Europeans will take a lot back with them. They'll also be introduced to new goods and spices and foods. So the Crusades, the impact of the Crusades or the relevance of the Crusades really is not so much the issue of Holy Lands. It's really that it just brought Western Europeans into contact with Muslims and the Byzantines, and they got reacquainted with Greek knowledge that eventually leads to the Renaissance, artistic styles, architectural. They'll also be introduced to new spices and luxury goods. So this is also going to create a huge economic surge for Western Europeans, as all of a sudden they now have a taste and a desire for these goods, so they want to trade more often. So that's really the long-term and impact of the Crusades here. And in fact, the final crusade wasn't even fighting against Muslims. It was actually Venetian merchants who were very powerful in the city-state of Italy there, and Italy, like Austria, present day there, and they're going to attack, because they feel competitive with the merchants, the Byzantine, in Constantinople. So it's very interesting if you were to ever deeply study the Crusades. What probably started off for religious reasons really evolved into more about money and power, and not so much about God and religion. So the significance, as I said, it put Western Europe into direct contact with the oldest areas of the world's civilizations. New contact with Islam opened Western Europeans' eyes to new possibilities, especially increases in trade. So some of the goods, so this comes up in the key concept as well, like knowing what goods were traded. Sugarcane, spices, porcelain. I've referred to that before. We're going to learn more about that in a couple weeks when we look at China this time, but Chinese porcelain. So when we still to this day, when you buy nice plates and dishes, we refer to it as China. Glassware, carpets from the east. The trade will be in balance, though, because Western Europe was not producing a lot of goods that the rest of the world wanted. For the most part, Western Europeans were good at producing wool and textiles, and so there will be a bit of this imbalance as Western Europeans recognize that they need to start to produce goods the rest of the world wants as well. At this time, Western Europeans did not produce luxury goods. They will be reacquainted with classical works, which will eventually lead to the Renaissance and the end of the medieval period. And so this does show the aggressive spirit of Western Europe to try to accelerate in prominence, and that aggressive spirit will definitely, over time, lead to Europeans surpassing some of the previous civilizations we've looked at in their advancements. So, in addition to the Crusades, Christians demonstrated their religious fervor not just by driving back Muslims from Jerusalem, but also through treatment of Jews. And so, this is going to be what's known as anti-Semitism. So, there was a lot of anti-Semitic Semitic feelings in Europe that existed for centuries. And I think that's something key to understand because we're all very well aware of World War II and Hitler and the Nazis and their treatment of Jews. But understand, Hitler and the Nazis really created a power base off of ideas and beliefs that had already long been in existence. Definitely doesn't make it right, but just know that they didn't create hate towards Jewish people. They were able to capitalize off of something that already existed, and then unfortunately they took it, to the level of genocide. But what you have happening in Western Europe, you have what's known as ghettos, and these were small urban areas where people, mostly Jews, were segregated from the Christian majority. So segregation of small communities within like a larger town or village. Pogroms were anti-Semitic mob actions against Jews in Eastern Europe. So pogroms were pretty common, especially in Russia. As medieval social and economic life grew complex, more restrictions on women emerged as well. So we're just kind of looking at social structures. Women were excluded from guilds. Guilds were kind of like early day trade unions, but guilds were run by artisans and craftsmen that really wanted to protect the integrity of their product, like a blacksmith. And so women's role in commerce will greatly decrease. Women were considered subservient to men and praised when docile and obedient. And it's kind of interesting. It's like this, you got kind of mixed messages, with the Catholic Church and this treatment of women, because in Catholicism you have the Virgin Mary, who's obviously held in very high regard. But then, in society, it doesn't play out quite that way. Women are expected to take a back seat, and that's kind of a continuity coming out of Rome as well. Roman women weren't expected to be prominent in politics or trade. So this will be endorsed by the church and their interpretation of biblical text to, especially going into, the issue of original sin and Adam and Eve, that women were secondary to men. So looking at the power of the Catholic Church, so the Catholic Church had its own hierarchy of power. So the Catholic Church becomes most powerful and wealthy institution in the West. This means what you're going to have is just like political leaders and kings that we've seen in this year so far sometimes become corrupt and misuse money and funds. The same thing will occur with popes. So it's kind of a similar overlap with you see happen with political leaders. The church also sometimes owned very large land holdings as well. Clear hierarchy of church power like the Roman government. Popes regulated doctrine, and just like a royal cult of Islam, early Germanic kings were interested in Christianity for political unification reasons. So abuse and corruption will occur with bad popes. These kind of specifics would not necessarily be on the AP exam, but they're interesting nonetheless if you look at it. Stephen VI had predecessors exhumed. That means they were dead, buried. So that means when you're exhumed, you're dug back up from your grave. They were tried, as in like a legal trial, defingered and thrown into the Tiber River. So why would he do that? And again, this is the question of, we asked the question last in the classical period, how did leaders show they were in charge? Well, it's the same thing. How did the Pope show his ultimate authority? John the 12th gave land to his mistress and murdered 7 people. Leo X spent 1/7 of his reserves on his papal ceremony, so that means just his coronation ceremony as Pope. And that's where's the church get their funds from? People donating and from kings and lords, and so there's definitely a corruption occurring here because it's not being used for the religious purposes that are essentially promised. Clement the Seventh Medici gets Rome attacked by France, Germany, and Spain. So again, looking at warfare and politics there. Urban VI complained he didn't hear cardinals screaming loudly enough when they were tortured for conspiring against him. So that means torture them more, torture them worse, make it more painful. So again, there was definitely the popes acted as power-hungry kings, essentially. So religious reform. So obviously the church starts to get criticized for this. So the era of Gregorian reform is noted with Gregory VII, and he recognized that the church had to stop behaving in such a manner. So he starts to work towards separating secular and religious spheres. So secular being, remember, non-religious. He tried to free the church from interference from states. So again, creating somewhat of a division between the church's role in society versus kings and monarchies' role in society. There will be quarrels with the Holy Roman Emperors Henry IV over investiture. Investiture refers to whose right is it to appoint bishops? Is it the king or the pope? So this is where you start to, as I mentioned earlier, it's a few slides back if you need to go back to it, it's a big lecture. But in feudalistic Europe, you had the power clash between nobles and king. So in England, that clash was the Magna Carta and then eventually the establishment of Parliament. But then you also had the clash of power between kings and pope. So investiture shows that power clash that was happening in Western Europe. So who appoints the bishops? Do the kings do that? If I'm a British king and I have a British bishop, is it my job to appoint the bishop, or does that come from the pope because he's technically the religious authority? So there's the power clash there. The investiture dispute was so intense that Henry IV was excommunicated by Gregory VII. Henry's confession indicated the Pope had gained the upper hand. And it proves the church will eventually, at this point, the church has established itself as superior to the state, meaning essentially the church won that argument over kings, and it affirmed papal authority. But again, this power struggle will continue and eventually leads to the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. Oops, went too fast. So several reform movements were created to combat perceived corruption in the church. The mendicant friar groups were established in the 13th century, and they depended on charity. They renounced worldly goods. They vowed a life of poverty so that all their energy could be spent on practicing and preaching their religion. And so this will help with average followers because they will see the Franciscans and the Dominicans in their countries living a pious and simple life. And we have monasticism, and this is why we don't like to use the word Dark Ages, because while maybe not everybody had contact with the classics and the works and reading, there were those that did still preserve it during this time period. So this began in the early Middle Ages and continued through the medieval period. It aided in the discipline of intense spirituality of devout Christians through celibacy and extreme piety. So monks, and you have a picture of a monk there. So monasticism, monk, kind of make that word association. It enabled monks to live and escape ordinary lives. The example of holy life to ordinary people. Monasteries were pilgrimage centers, and they will bring Christianity to northern Germany and Scandinavia as well. Scandinavia, like the Vikings, eventually convert to Christianity. Intellectual life and literacy declined except among churchmen and monasteries, so hence not really a Dark Ages. Study early Christian writings from the Roman Empire. Monks often employed by monarchs since they are literate, so they basically were able to write letters and perform some government functions as well. And they were also very well educated, so sometimes they became advisors to kings. Benedict of Nursia created Benedictine rule for monks that I mentioned earlier. So this is he's known as the founder of Western monasticism, and it established the spiritual guidelines. And it was meant for so that way monks and nuns could create an example to Christians of a righteous, pious path in life. And there you go. Got a review question. And so so a little bit more on theology. So we went through Islam kind of quick a couple weeks ago, but this is going to be a common issue in both Islam and Christianity. Is you have religious leaders who also are intellectually stimulated and study the Greek classics, and they try to come to a consensus. How does rational secular thought coexist with religion? And sometimes these people will be criticized. It happened in Islam. It'll happen down the road with the scientific revolution in Europe. Galileo, for example, is a devout Catholic, but he'll be put on trial by the church for some of his scientific theories. But what we see happen in Western Europe is, this theology is how do you assimilate faith and reason? So assimilate means to combine. How do they coexist? So you have the exploration of Greek philosophy and assimilation to Catholic religious tradition. Debates in universities arose how to combine rational philosophy with Christian faith. Both monks and scholars were interested in this issue. Bernard of Clairvaux was a monk. He was opposed to the integration of Greek philosophy into Catholic tradition. He supported mysticism, received truth through faith and union with God, and not through Greek reason. So some religious authorities will completely, loud motorcycle just went by. So some religious leaders will try to completely resist Greek reason and see it as heretical to religious thought. However, not all will agree with that. And what you have, and this is a key concept here, scholasticism is going to develop in Western Europe. And this is a notable intellectual movement that attempted to reconcile beliefs and values of Christianity with the logical reasoning of Greek philosophy. And this was led by St. Thomas Aquinas. And he's going to say your faith is primary, so your faith in God comes first, but reason leads to understanding. So it actually, with the use of rational thought, you can actually have a greater understanding of your faith. Therefore, it is possible to reconcile Greek philosophy with Catholic theology. Other components, as we kind of wrap up here, are some of our remaining Sprite G categories of Western Europe. So looking at urbanization and education. So urbanization is the growth of cities, urban areas. So we're going to have migrations, population is going to increase as food production increases, economic growth often aids in population increase as well. So towns grow, and so you have growing economies and markets. Literacy is going to start to expand into urban centers, and you have a decrease in Viking raids. And with a decrease of raids, that also leads to stability. And when you have political stability, this allows for other developments to evolve because people aren't worried about protecting themselves, such as artistic and intellectual developments. So you start to have an emphasis on education, and around the 11th century, cathedral schools are going to start to train children to be future clergy members. And so this is going to lead to a spread of literacy. They're reading the Bible and they're reading religious doctrines, but they're still learning to read. From the 13th century, universities are going to train students in theology, medicine, and law, and they're going to rely on secular education. So it's going to, from the 11th to the 13th century, it's not just going to be religious thought that is taught, but secular education as well. So Arab, Greek sciences are going to be relearned as well. This helps to create economic and cultural vitality in Europe after 1000. So that's why we have the shift from the early, what used to be called Dark Ages, to the High Middle Ages. Religion and art and literature, architecture, literature, and art is going to reflect religious themes, so there's a very close relationship there. Painting on wood panels, religious scenes, no perspective during this time period. What that means is everything's very two-dimensional. You saw that a lot with the Byzantine art as well. I mean, it's mosaics, but very two-dimensional. So basically what that means is things look very flat. They don't look realistic. You don't have depth perception. Romanesque architecture, so for pilgrimages, so you're going to see very blocky Roman-like architecture. Then you have the Gothic architecture of the 11th century. So it's going to be very light and intricate. So what this symbolizes is that there's a growing technical skill and it's expensive. So again, these are all things that reflect that historians look at this to see what is the evidence of the shift in culture and economic development. Literature, Latin is going to be the language used for law and education, but then territories are going to rely on vernacular for secular literature. This means fiction and tales. And vernacular just means using local language. So if you are in a Frankish territory, what later becomes France, the people speak French, but law and education might still be written in Latin. And you're going to have also the court poetry, and chivalry is going to be a social custom, and it basically is a very detailed outline of how men should behave in public and with women and so forth. And so that's a key component of medieval Europe. And so you have some artwork here, and you can see, an evolution of, it's not quite perfect depth perception, but you're starting to see things becoming a bit more realistic and less flat. Agricultural innovation. So this is was in your key terms a bit from Quizlet. Warmer temperatures. So basically Europe is at the end of the Little Ice Age at this time. And as the earth starts to warm, it's going to increase crop production. So some of the technologies that Western Europeans developed for agriculture, the mold board, it was a curved iron plate and allowed deeper turning of heavy soil. So again, it's making it, whenever you make the job easier for a peasant and a farmer, that means you have increased production. Then they start to recognize the productivity of if you rotate crops. Essentially what happens is, say you always grow tomatoes in one area and tomatoes only rely on certain nutrients. And so if you keep growing tomatoes in the same spot of your land, eventually they're going to take away all of the nutrients that they rely on, and they don't replenish those nutrients. And then, so if you crop rotate, say you have tomatoes, I'm trying to think of European crops, and then, beans, if you rotate them, then every other year those plants take nutrients, replenish different nutrients, and so it keeps the soil healthier. And Europeans are going to discover this. And so they leave half of the land uncultivated each year to restore the soil as well. And then they develop the three field system. So a third of the land will be left unplanted. So at any given time, a third of the land's not planted, and then you rotate the other crops, and this keeps the soil healthier over the long run. Again, it's going to create an increase in agricultural production, which will also help create agricultural surpluses, which will also help growing cities. And they develop new horse collar and stirrups. Agricultural improvements is going to increase production, which means this is going to start to mark a massive population growth in Western Europe, and that means cities will grow in size as well. Peasants will also begin to gain financial freedom with these agricultural advances. Some will become free farmers, meaning they'll actually be able to own their own land, and no longer are they tied to lords, or they sometimes move to cities and engage in other economic pursuits. So this is also the mark of ending feudalism, having less reliance on vassals and lords. So the growth of trade and banking. So in the Low Countries of the north, you have the Netherlands. Cloth was their key economic product. England had wool, France wine and cheese, Scandinavia was timber, fish, and fur. Money is going to replace the barter system, so this is why we consider this later time period the High Middle Ages, because they are now evolving into more modern economic activities like some of our other empires. And then we're going to see our first major European trade network. So you have Northern European Trade Network. So this green area is known as the Hanseatic League, and this was a confederation of merchant guilds of northern German lands in Scandinavia. You also, if you look at these red and blue lines, these are our Italian merchants that are going to utilize sea lanes. And what you should be seeing here is that all of these trade routes, and then overland, so land trade routes, all of these trade routes connect with one another. They also are connecting with Northern Africa here, the Middle East, which means they're going to connect with Silk Road, Indian Ocean Network. And so, as I said, period 3, one of the key concepts and one of the key things to understand is just the massive increase in trade and communication networks. So the Hanseatic League is going to help facilitate trade as more towns are going to purchase charters from kings and sever their feudal ties. So what does this mean? No longer people showing their loyalty to a lord. They're now going to create a charter through the king that they're allowed to conduct trade, and then they'll pay their taxes directly to a king, and then the kings are able to use that revenue to build their standing armies. So this also leads to an end of feudalism with the increase of trade. Growth of trade and banking, growth in trade networks, the rise of the merchant class. So this is where now the social structure in Western Europe has become more complex. If you were to go to the beginning of this video, in that initial triangle, there were no merchants in that feudalism social hierarchy, and so this is going to be more complexity here. As the economy grows, merchants are considered power in trading cities as weak governments fail to regulate merchants. Merchants will become wealthy, sometimes even wealthier than those traditional lords and nobles, and so they will start to use that wealth to try to gain tremendous influence, and even eventually try to fight for, say in places like England with a parliament, try to fight for entry within some of that parliamentary power. So this will be another challenge to maintaining feudalism. Feudalism does not have room for a merchant class. And especially since merchants are generally not of noble birth, it's also going to start to challenge people's ideas of wealth and authority and power, and where does it come from? Is it hereditary, or is it through your financial success? However, they could amass a huge fortune and live like aristocrats. So while they might have been denied the same government power and influence of aristocrats, they could still live the life of an aristocrat with their luxury goods. So despite monetary wealth, merchants are going to are still considered low social status, because they're not going to be allowed into those government positions or bureaucracies. And there's also going to start to raise a concern in Christianity as people become more competitive and as capitalism starts to emerge in Western Europe. There's going to be criticisms from the church that this is undermining some of the ideologies of Christianity to be kind and give and work collaboratively with one another. And as the economy becomes more complex, you have just the development of guilds. These are organizations that group people in the same business or trade in a single city. So whether it be merchants, weavers, woolmen, sculptors, artists, blacksmiths, and their whole point was to stress financial security. So essentially, they, in a guild, you have this organization. You guys work together to control your product, to make sure that one, the product is being made at the standard that is expected, but two, you also regulate who can become an apprentice, how many producers are allowed in that organization, and so it also kind of helps control costs of your product and prices and maintain financial stability for the people that are members of that guild. So it was a way to protect their market and set prices. They ensured standards, they regulated apprenticeships, and they provided training materials to also encourage the quality of their products. And so this is kind of similar to modern day unions. And the role of women. So the traditional roles, wife and child care provider, so definitely patriarchal in Western Europe. As I mentioned earlier, the code of chivalry reinforced ideas that women were weak and subordinate. Nun, being a nun was really the only alternative women had to marriage. The expectations that you got married and had children, and if you weren't going to do that, then you went to a monastery and you practiced religious devotion. And so here I kind of alluded to this earlier, that there was kind of like these two conflicting attitudes towards women in Western Europe. You had the veneration, or the worship and upholding of someone, a symbol like Mary, and female saints that gave women a cultural and religious prestige. However, for the average woman, there tended to be more of this emphasis on Eve as a source of sin. So women were generally seen as manipulative and sexual and dishonest, and not to be trusted, and they had to be monitored by men. Women were not allowed property rights, but they could trade and belong to some craft guilds. Growing literature is going to discuss women's roles as comforters to men, and when women were considered virtuous or beautiful or female, it was usually attached to docile and subservient behaviors, and so that's going to be what's promoted for women. So the decline of the medieval world after 1300, overpopulation, there will be severe famine, warfare, and disease. We'll learn later that through Silk Road trade, the Black Death, the bubonic plague, will eventually make its way from China to Western Europe. It's going to kill half of the European population, so it's going to be a huge disturbance in the affairs of Europeans. So as I said, it started in China, traveled along Silk Road, unintentionally spread by the Mongols as they conquered and they reinvigorated Silk Road trade. Soldiers were either already dead, feverish, and delirious, and had boils that oozed blood and pus as they traveled on ship. It significantly weakened the manorial system because there was literally not enough people left to maintain it. Knights are going to lose their military purpose, and they're just going to kind of become decorative. Foot soldiers are going to be more important and practical, and foot soldiers are also going to be now directly employed by kings through their standing army. So you have the growth of professional armies. This shook the authority of feudal lords who used to supply armies. So basically, as I said quite a few times, because our common theme is how do you consolidate power. So kings eventually consolidate power through taxing people directly and building their own armies. New weaponry will make its way into Western Europe, cannons and gunpowder, and that came from the Mongols and the Chinese, so we'll look at that a little deeper in a couple weeks. And aristocracy will not disappear. They'll choose to live in rich ceremonial style that exhibits court life and chivalry. And this map here shows the spread of the Black Death, so you may want to pause the video and look at that. So changing culture, the church will become increasingly very rigid. There'll be a series of controversies over papal authority, and you'll start to see governments trying to distance themselves from church authority. Reformers and mystics will emerge, so they no longer need the church to have direct experience with God, especially as literacy starts to spread, so people are able to read religious doctrine for themselves. And we have what's known as the Proto-Renaissance, so not quite the Renaissance, but the lead up to the Renaissance, where intellectual and artistic life is going to develop. Vernacular languages for the first time are seen more important than the religious language of Latin. And art is going to become more realistic in its portrayal of space and nature. And then by the time we get to the Renaissance, artwork gets very realistic when artists start to develop the use of perspective when they paint. And there we go. That was a long one. You guys are troopers. So hopefully you have a chance to look at this weekend. All right. Bye-bye.